Thank you, Mr. President, for declaring this day of prayer and remembrance. It's important right now, especially after the passing of Billy Graham in 2018. His children found surprising documents in his North Carolina study. These writings revealed the personal struggles of America's well-known preacher. In Substio per Ego, these papers showed surprising truths about his loss of faith that nearly ended his ministry, his real relationship with Nixon, and his biggest regrets. He was a man millions recognized from television. Billy Graham was born on November 7, 1918, just before World War I ended. He grew up on a large dairy farm near Charlotte, North Carolina, where his parents, William and Maro Graham, owned 300 acres and had over 70 cows. Billy worked hard as a child. He woke up early each day to milk 20 cows, and then he had to do it again later. Going to school helped him learn discipline and a good work ethic. When he was 15, something unusual occurred after the end of Prohibition. His father made him and his sister drink beer until they... Billy disliked alcohol for the rest of his life after he got sick from it. As a teenager, he was just like any other kid, more focused on baseball and girls. However, he eventually preached to millions around the world. By the time he was older, his sermons were heard by over 2 billion people on TV and radio. It's surprising that someone with such humble beginnings could make such a big difference. Everything changed for him when he was 16 in 1934, during a revival meeting in Charlotte led by a preacher named Maro Graham. That same year, a group of local businessmen had prayed at the Graham farm, asking God to raise someone from their town to spread his message. At first, Billy didn't even want to go to the revival. He had been rejected by a local youth group for being too worldly, and he wasn't interested in religious events. But a farm named Albert MCM kept pushing him to go. Finally, Billy agreed. At the revival, something incredible happened. Billy didn't remember what the preacher said, but he felt deeply moved. It was like something... When he was talking to him, he felt heavy footsteps as he walked to the front to give his life to Christ. This moment changed everything for him. Billy's choice to follow Christ would eventually help millions of others learn about God. However, Billy's journey was not easy. At 18, he went to Bob Jones College, but he had a hard time there. The rules were strict, and he didn't fit in. He nearly got expelled after just one semester, and the school's founder told him he wouldn't achieve much and might only be a small-town preacher. Instead of giving up, Billy persevered. Billy decided to move to Florida Bible Institute, and this choice changed his life. At the new school, he felt more supported and practiced his sermons in unique ways, even preaching to birds, trees, and alligators by a river. In 1938, something significant happened one night while he was walking on the school's golf course. He felt confused about his future, so he knelt in the grass and told God he would do whatever was needed. This moment led him to commit to a life of preaching. In 1939, at just 20 years old, Billy became a Southern Baptist minister. He was raised as a Presbyterian but admired the Baptist faith and decided to join it. He was baptized by immersion in a lake, which was different from the sprinkling he experienced as a child. His ordination showed that people believed in his ability to share God's message, even at a young age. Billy Graham started his journey to becoming a famous evangelist during World War II, and the following years, at just 25, he gave his first Youth for Christ sermon on May 27, 1944, in Chicago, and over 2,000 people came to listen to him. This was the start of something big, and soon he began traveling. In January 1945, he became the first full-time worker for Youth for Christ, a group that organizes events for young people. He traveled across the U.S., Canada, and Europe, speaking at rallies and setting up chapters. Over the next 7 years, he spoke in more than 300 cities, reaching thousands of people. These early experiences shaped him into the enthusiastic preacher he became known as. The Youth for Christ rallies were lively and engaging, featuring music, celebrity stories, and plenty of energy, not just preaching. These events drew large crowds, sometimes up to 700 people. Many young individuals felt inspired by his message, especially after the tough times of the war. By 1946, Youth for Christ had expanded rapidly, with about 300 chapters in the U.S. and over 200 abroad. These rallies marked the beginning of something greater, not only for Billy but also for other groups like World Vision and his own Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. A key moment came with the 1949 Los Angeles Crusade, which started on September 25th under a large tent called the Canvas Cathedral. At first, only about 3,000 people showed up, but then something amazing happened. Stuart Ham, a famous radio host, decided to follow Christ during the event. A few days later, Louis Zamperini, a war hero and former Olympian, also made the same choice. This got the attention of media leader William Randolph Hearst, who ordered his newspapers to promote Billy Graham. Suddenly, everyone in the country was talking about him. What was supposed to be a 3-week crusade ended up lasting 8 weeks, with around 400,000 people attending and thousands making commitments. For Christ, this event made Billy a household name and opened doors for more crusades across the country. In 1950, Billy realized he needed to find a way to organize his expanding mission. That's when the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, BGEEA, was founded. It began in a tiny office in Minnesota with the aim of spreading the word in every way it could. Their first project was a radio show called Hour of Decision, which started in November 1950. The program became very famous and reached millions of people around the globe. The BGEA became a worldwide group with offices in cities like London, Sydney, and Buenos Aires. They began printing magazines, creating movies, and making TV shows. This helped Billy's word reach more people. In 1948, 2 years before the BGEA was formed, Billy and his team promised to follow strict ethical rules. They were concerned about scandals that had affected other preachers. In a meeting in Modesto, California, they created something called the Modesto Manifesto. They agreed to be open about their money, avoid any hint of sexual misconduct, cooperate with local churches, and not exaggerate their achievements. This established the way Billy's ministry functioned and gained the trust of millions. Billy Graham changed how people spread the Christian word globally. His efforts brought together millions of people and made him famous worldwide. In 1954, he had his first major international event in London that lasted for 12 weeks, and more than 2 million people attended to hear him talk. He began his worldwide goal by bringing large crowds together and using media, with help from local churches, to connect with more people than ever before. One of the most amazing things about Graham's work was how he brought people together, even in areas with big differences. In 1973, during apartheid in South Africa, he held a rally in Durban. Over 1,000,000 people came, and Graham made sure everyone was seated together, no matter their race. He called racism a sin, which upset the government, but gained him respect worldwide. In 1977, he preached in communist Hungary, where faith was often restricted. In 5 days, he talked to over 300 people. This allowed him to visit other communist countries, including North Korea, in 1992, in 1995. Graham did something no one had ever done before. He used satellites to send his message to 185 countries in 116 languages, all at the same time. Over 10 million people watched, and by the time he left, he had talked to over 215 million people in person across 185 countries. His message received 5 million responses, and his biggest audience was in South Korea in 1973, where 1 million people attended. 1 million people came together. His efforts went beyond just numbers. They changed lives. In 1986, a young man in Amsterdam who was dealing with drug addiction went to an event and later became a Christian leader in the Netherlands. Graham didn't only focus on live events, he also used media to connect with more people. His radio show, Hour of Decision, began in 1950. Within a year, it was available on 150 stations, and by 1954, it had reached 800 stations around the world. He liked live shows because he thought they seemed more real to listeners. He also made a big effect on TV. In 1957, his New York crusade was shown on ABC for 16 weeks. It had 96 million viewers, which is around 70% of all TV-owning homes at that time. Many people were so excited that ABC's phone lines were overwhelmed with calls on the first night. In 1981, Graham connected with 50 million people in Africa using a satellite feed. Many Africans were seeing this event for the first time. His team had to bring in generators by plane to provide electricity for tools in remote locations. Graham wrote a newspaper piece called My Answer, which was published in many newspapers and read by 5 million people. Even in his old age, he welcomed new technology. In 1989, he launched one of the first Christian websites that allowed people to talk with counselors about their spiritual questions. By 2008, his online service was assisting more than 1.5 million people each year. In 1956, Graham started Christianity Today, a magazine that became an important platform for Christians. He got the idea late at night and stayed up to write down his plans for the magazine. He and his team gathered a lot of money to start it and sent free copies of the first issue to Protestant preachers all over America. The magazine became famous fast and discussed important topics like civil rights and the Vietnam War. Even though there were financial issues at first, it became one of the most respected Christian magazines. Billy Graham's life changed totally in 1949 when he experienced something that challenged his faith. At 30 years old, he was gaining popularity as a speaker, but he began to have questions about the Bible. This was odd for him because he had always believed in the Bible without doubt. His friend Charles Templeton, who was studying at Princeton, was one reason he began to have questions. Templeton was wondering how the Bible could align with current beliefs. This made Graham start to doubt whether he could fully trust the Bible. This was a serious issue since his biggest event, the Los Angeles Crusade, was only a few weeks away. If he didn't fully accept the Bible, how could he speak confidently about it? Graham felt confused and uncertain. He wanted solutions, so he went to Forest Home, a peaceful Christian retreat in the California mountains. He thought being there would help him understand things better. At the retreat, Graham spoke with Henrietta Mears, a knowledgeable Christian teacher, and others who offered him guidance. They warned him that if he lost faith in the Bible, he might also lose faith in other things. They urged him to seek help from God. One evening, Graham took a walk by himself in the woods at Forest Home. He paused at a tree stump, set his Bible on it, and started to pray. He said to God that he didn't know everything, but he chose to have faith in the Bible. He prayed, "I am going to believe this is your word, even if I don't understand everything." After this moment, Graham felt a big weight lift off his shoulders. He said he felt God's presence so strongly that it made him cry. This was the moment that changed everything for him. When the Los Angeles Crusade began on September 25, 1949, Graham was a very different speaker. He spoke with assurance and enthusiasm, frequently beginning his talks with, "The Bible says." People could sense his strong belief in what he was saying. The crusade was meant to last 3 weeks, but it was stretched to 8 weeks because many people wanted to listen to him. More than 3,500 people were there, and 3,000 chose to follow Christ. William Randolph Hearst, a newspaper owner, instructed his writers to support Graham, which made him widely known across the country. From that point on, Graham moved forward without hesitation. He became one of the best evangelists in history. In his lifetime, he preached to over 215 million people in 185 countries. His biggest audience was in South Korea, where 1.1 million people came to listen to him. His straightforward style and emphasis on the Bible helped millions of people understand and believe. That night by the tree stump at Forest Home not only changed Billy Graham's life, but it also changed the future of evangelical Christianity. Billy Graham had a close relationship with many U.S. leaders, but he had a special bond with Richard Nixon. He met Nixon in the 1950s when Nixon was a senator, and they grew very close over the years. By 1968, Graham was actively involved in Nixon's campaign, writing memos and giving tips on how to gain support from evangelical voters. He wasn't only a spiritual guide, he also played a role in the political plans. Graham went to the White House 30 times between 1969 and 1974. Sometimes he stayed the night. He prayed at Nixon's inauguration in 1969, saying that God picked him as a leader and provided guidance on important topics like the Vietnam War. In a surprising statement, Graham proposed bombing the dikes in North Vietnam if the peace talks did not succeed. That could have harmed many innocent people, but it revealed the extent of his participation. Even during the Watergate scandal, Graham remained close to. Nixon defended himself openly and didn't think he had done anything wrong. But when the White House tapes were revealed, Graham was shocked. After reading the transcripts in 1974, he couldn't believe Nixon's lies, and it affected him deeply. He cried. The betrayal made Graham reconsider how involved he was in politics. In 2002, a different issue from his past caused a scandal. Tapes from 1972 showed a conversation between Graham and Nixon where they made anti-Semitic remarks. Nixon talked about Jewish influence in the media, and Graham agreed, calling it a problem that needed to be addressed. He stated that while many Jewish people were nice to him, they didn't know his true feelings. When the tapes were released years later, people were shocked by his comments. An 83-year-old man said he couldn't recall a specific conversation but apologized, explaining that his words didn't reflect his love for Jewish people. However, the situation damaged his reputation as a unifier. As he aged, he acknowledged making mistakes. In a 2011 interview, he expressed regret for getting too involved in politics. He thought it was important to offer spiritual guidance to leaders, but felt he had gone too far. The Watergate scandal opened his eyes to the fact that Nixon had lied, which changed his perspective on politics permanently. He later cautioned against certain political actions. In 1981, he warned against mixing religion and politics too much, saying it could harm both religion and the country. One of his most controversial moments was after Nixon resigned in 1974. He encouraged President Gerald Ford to pardon Nixon, believing it would help the country heal. He called Nixon to offer support and urged Ford to grant the pardon. Graham also publicly defended the pardon, saying it was important for recovery. Many people were angry, but Graham believed he was doing the right thing. He had a strong influence on presidents, but being close to political power also came with risks. He thought he was helping, but sometimes it was hard to separate his faith from politics. Some people admired what he did, while others criticized him for being too involved. These moments are part of his story. In 1953, during a campaign in Chattanooga, Tennessee, Billy Graham was surprised to see ropes dividing white people and black people. He dismantled the sections set up for the audience himself. He warned the organizers that if the ropes dividing people stayed up, he would not participate in the event. This occurred a year before schools were desegregated. While some people backed him, others were upset. The main usher resigned, and Graham lost some white supporters, but he stood firm. From then on, he ensured that all his events had mixed seating, even in the heavily segregated South. In 1957, during a gathering in New York City, Graham saw that most of the crowd was white and sought advice from Howard Jones, a black man. Pastor Jones advised him to share his message in Harlem. Graham followed this advice and organized rallies in Harlem and Brooklyn, attracting thousands of black attendees. This changed the audience at his events, but not everyone was pleased. Graham got hateful messages from segregationists who insulted him. In 1964, after a tragic church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama, Graham held a mixed-race crusade there. Protesters damaged the event's billboards, and police had to ensure his safety, even though Graham supported integration. Many people attacked him for not doing more during the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders used direct action and protest to fight racism. Graham, on the other hand, didn't use these methods. When King was arrested for a sit-in 1960, Graham said that people should follow the law even if it was unfair. This made civil rights leaders angry because they thought that bad laws should be challenged. Graham believed that faith could change people's hearts and that both black and white people needed a personal relationship with God. Some people believed that a personal relationship with Jesus could help fight against racism. However, this view did not tackle the larger problem of systemic injustice. During the civil rights movement, many felt this approach was insufficient. In 1963, when peaceful protesters in Birmingham were attacked by police using fire hoses and dogs, Graham didn't speak out much. He also didn't attend the March on Washington where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech. Instead, Graham suggested that true equality would only come when Christ returns. Some people thought this sounded like he didn't think people could make a difference in the present. Graham wasn't sure if he could fully back the civil rights movement because he had ties to political leaders, including segregationists in 1965. During the Selma voting rights campaign, Graham said, "I don't condone violence, it's not the best way." This made civil rights leaders angry because they thought peaceful protests were needed to make a difference. Graham and King had a tense relationship in In 1957, Graham asked King to pray at his New York event. King's prayer focused on unity and brotherhood. Later, he praised Graham for tackling race issues. However, in 1958, their relationship became strained when King asked Graham not to let a segregationist politician speak at a Texas event. Graham didn't follow this advice, saying he avoided political issues. Graham later claimed King told him to stick to speaking in stadiums and not join protests, but there is no evidence of this conversation, and some experts question its accuracy. Graham had mixed views on race issues. He asked for integrated seating at his events, but sometimes allowed segregated choirs. After the violence in Selma in 1965, he preached in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, saying he was only there to talk about the gospel and not local issues. Many felt this was a way to avoid discussing the real problems of racism. In a 1960 article, he argued that forcing integration wouldn't work because you can't make people love each other through coercion. While he supported some changes, his words often seemed to justify the status quo. Later in life, Graham said he could have done more. In 1989, he said, "I wish I had done more for civil rights when I was younger." Some people praised his honesty, while others wondered why someone with his power hadn't taken a stronger stand. Billy Graham's love life was full of problems. Billy's marriage to Ruth Bell Graham was like a romance novel. They met at Wheaton College in 1940, when he was working on a furniture truck and saw Ruth for the first time. It took him a whole month to get the nerve to ask her to go on their first date. One of Ruth's favorite activities was listening to Handel's Messiah. On December 15, 1940, Ruth had always wanted to be a missionary in Tibet, but she believed God wanted her to follow a different path. After praying and thinking it over, she chose to marry Billy, feeling she could help with his work for God in her own way. They got married on August 13, 1943, 2 months after finishing their studies at Wheaton College. Their marriage lasted 63 years, ending with Ruth's death in 2007. Billy traveled a lot for his work, but they stayed close by making daily phone calls when they were apart and praying together every night when they were together. Ruth once said, "I'd prefer to have a little bit of Bill rather than a lot of any other man," which shows how much she cared for him. They also had some conflicts. When Billy told Ruth she couldn't drive after their car accident, she joked, "Abraham didn't take Sarah's camel away." Billy often said that Ruth was the biggest influence in his life and the rock of their family. Billy's views on Christianity changed as he got older. At first, he stuck to strong fundamentalist beliefs, but then he began to see things in a new way. He chose to welcome people from various Christian backgrounds to his work. In the late 1940s and 1950s, he decided to collaborate with major Protestant churches and some Catholic organizations. This move upset some of his first supporters, but it helped him connect with more people. By the 1960s, his shows were attracting large crowds, sometimes more than 1,000 people. Billy wanted to tell as many people as he could about Jesus. He thought the Bible was inspired by God, but didn't agree with strict readings. In 1964, he met Pope Paul VI, which surprised many of his Protestant fans. Graham worked with Catholic leaders at his events and encouraged Catholics to go back to their neighborhood churches. Some of his opinions stirred discussions, especially when he suggested that people who never met Jesus could still be saved if they followed what was right in their hearts. These ideas led some religious leaders to criticize him, but Billy remained focused on sharing God's love with everyone. Billy had strong opinions about social problems, but he approached them carefully. He thought that life begins at conception and opposed abortion after the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973. He didn't use strong language or become too political. He wanted to be kind and understanding. On same-sex marriage, he believed in the usual idea of marriage between a man and a woman. In 2012, when he was 93 years old, he paid for newspaper ads to back his opinion, but he never spoke negatively about others. He once said, "We shouldn't criticize everything we don't agree with," showing that he values kindness more than criticism. In his later years, Billy had many physical problems but remained strong in his faith. He was identified with Parkinson's disease in 1992, which made it difficult for him to move and talk. He also developed prostate cancer and hydrocephalus, which is a disease where fluid accumulates in the brain. Even with surgeries and treatments, he kept serving in his mission for as long as possible. By the time he reached his 90s, he had trouble seeing and hearing, but his mind remained clear. In his book Nearing Home, he talks about getting older and getting ready for death, explaining that his faith helps him feel calm. Billy's last major public event was his 95th birthday in 2013. After that, he lived at home in Montreat, North Carolina, with his family and helpers. He died in 2018 at the age of 99, leaving a legacy of love, faith, and a message that touched millions.